It was the winter of 1961, 3 weeks before Christmas, and the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas hummed with the kind of electricity that only existed when the city believed it was being watched by the whole world, which it always was, because the whole world was always watching, and nobody understood that better than Francis Albert Sinatra, who stood at the edge of the backstage corridor on a Tuesday evening wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most men in Nevada earned in a month, holding a cigarette he hadn't lit, turning it slowly between two fingers the way a conductor turns a baton before the orchestra draws breath, his dark eyes fixed on a door that led to the main showroom floor where 1,200 people were already seated, already drinking, already expecting something extraordinary from a night that had not yet decided what it intended to be. The name on the dressing room door to his left read Marcus Webb, written in pencil on a strip of white tape. The kind of improvised label that told you everything you needed to know about how seriously the hotel management had taken the booking, which was to say, not seriously at all, which was precisely the problem, which was precisely why Frank was standing in this particular corridor at this particular hour, instead of upstairs in his suite drinking Jack Daniel and going over the set list for his own performance the following evening. Marcus Webb was 23 years old, born in Birmingham, Alabama, raised in Detroit, trained at a conservatory in New York where his piano professor had reportedly wept the first time he heard the boy play Ravel, and he had arrived in Las Vegas 4 days earlier under a contract, arranged through a booking agency that had assured him, in writing, that he would be performing as the opening act for 3 consecutive nights in the Copa Room, one of the most coveted stages in the country, a room that could make a career the way a single sentence could make a headline. What the contract had not mentioned, what the booking agency had either failed to discover or chosen not to disclose, was that the Copa Room's general manager, a squat and permanently perspiring man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked for the Sands since its opening and believed he had earned the right to run his room the way a feudal lord ran a province, had no intention of allowing a black musician to headline even a supporting slot in his showroom, not because he had been explicitly instructed by the hotel's ownership to maintain such a policy, but because he had absorbed the ambient architecture of exclusion so completely over the course of his career that he no longer recognized it as a policy at all. He simply experienced it as a preference, the way one might prefer not to serve warm champagne. And when Marcus Webb had arrived at the Sands on Saturday with his road manager and his arrangements and his absolutely extraordinary hand, Gerald Fitch had informed him with the peculiar courtesy of a man who believes he is doing you a favor by being honest that there had been a misunderstanding, that the Copa Room was fully committed through the new year, that perhaps the booking agency had confused the dates, that perhaps Marcus would like to be put in touch with a smaller venue downtown, perhaps the lounge at one of the motels on Fremont Street, perhaps somewhere more suited to his current level of visibility. And Marcus Webb had stood in that lobby in his good wool coat and his polished shoes, and he had said nothing at all for a long moment. And then he had said, very quietly, that he would like to speak with someone in management. And Gerald Fitch had smiled and said that he was management, and Marcus had said he understood, and he had walked back to his room at the Flamingo, where his band was staying because the Sands did not accommodate black guests. And he had called his booking agency, and his booking agency had called the Sands, and the Sands had told the booking agency that there had been a clerical error, and that they were deeply sorry, and that if Marcus Webb was in town, he was welcome to perform in the lounge bar on Sunday evening as a goodwill gesture, unpaid, as a showcase opportunity. And the booking agency had been about to relay this offer when Marcus Webb's road manager, a wiry Chicagoan named Delroy Sims, who had been navigating the music industry's casual architecture of diminishment for 20 years, and had developed a finely calibrated instinct for when something needed to be escalated versus when it needed to be absorbed, had called a contact of his in New York who knew someone who worked for an entertainment lawyer who had once done work for Sinatra's management office, and somehow, through a chain of telephone calls that crossed 3 time zones over the course of 36 hours, a message had reached the ear of Frank Sinatra that there was a young pianist in Las Vegas who had been booked into the Copa Room, and then quietly uninvited by a man who did not have the legal authority to uninvite him, and who had also made the tactical error of doing this in a city where Frank Sinatra lived part of the year and had opinions. What happened next was not what most people would have expected from a man of Sinatra's temperament. because the expectation, shaped by a decade of tabloid coverage and cocktail party mythology, was that Frank would make a telephone call in a raised voice, or that he would send someone to deliver a message in a raised voice, or that there would be some form of theatrical confrontation in a public place involving the raised voice and possibly a thrown object, because that was the Sinatra the newspapers had assembled for public consumption, the volatile king, the man who settled disputes the way weather settles disputes, suddenly and with considerable collateral damage. But that was not what happened. What happened was that Frank Sinatra finished his dinner, poured himself a second drink, lit a cigarette, sat in an armchair in his suite, and thought for approximately 40 minutes, which was longer than most people would have imagined he was capable of sitting quietly with a problem. And then he made 2 telephone calls, and both calls lasted less than 4 minutes, and he did not raise his voice in either of them. And then he put on his jacket and took the elevator to the lobby and walked to the Copa room and found Gerald Fitch supervising the arrangement of cocktail tables and told him, in a tone that was conversational to the point of sounding almost bored, that Marcus Webb would be performing his contracted 3 nights in the Copa room beginning Tuesday, and that the Copa room would be providing Marcus Webb with the full production support specified in his contract, including sound, lighting, and a house piano tuned to concert pitch, and that if Gerald had any questions or concerns about this arrangement, he was welcome to discuss them with Jack Tratter, who was the general manager of the entire Sands Hotel and who had already been briefed. And Frank said this last part not as a threat, but as information, the way you might tell someone that the weather report predicted rain, just so they could plan accordingly. And then he had turned and walked back toward the elevator without waiting for a response, because there was no response to wait for. The conversation had reached its conclusion. Gerald Fitch had stood among his cocktail tables for a long moment after that, and then he had gone to his office and called Jack Tratter, who confirmed everything Frank had said in a tone that made it clear the subject was not open for discussion. And Gerald had replaced the receiver and sat at his desk and understood, in the way that men who have spent their lives accumulating small powers sometimes suddenly understand, that the architecture of his authority had just been rearranged without anyone asking his opinion about the renovations. Tuesday evening, Marcus Webb arrived at the Sands stage door at 6:30 in his good wool coat and his polished shoes, and found that his name had been added to the performers list at the security desk, that a dressing room had been assigned to him, that the house piano had been tuned that afternoon by a technician who had been called in specifically for this purpose, and that a stage manager named Roberto, who had worked the Copa room for 9 years, was waiting to walk him through the technical requirements of the space, with a professionalism that was so complete and so unremarkable that it made the events of the preceding 4 days feel briefly like something that had happened to someone else in a different city. Frank Sinatra was not in the Copa room when Marcus Webb took the stage that Tuesday evening. He was in the corridor backstage, standing alone, cigarette unlit, watching through a gap in the curtain as 1,200 people who had come to see a headliner they recognized settled into their seats and oriented themselves toward an opening act they had never heard of, which was the most honest test there was, because a crowd that doesn't know who you are is a crowd that has not yet decided to like you. And what Marcus Webb did in the next 47 minutes, with that uncertainty, was something that a very small number of people witnessed in person, and that none of them forgot for the rest of their lives. He began with something quiet, a melody that seemed to arrive from somewhere outside the room, something you couldn't quite name but felt you had always known, and the conversations that were still threading through the cocktail tables died one by one, not dramatically, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the music had created a gravity that pulled attention the way a fire pulls attention, without announcing itself, simply by existing. And by the time Marcus reached the first movement of his own composition, a piece he called Birmingham Winter, which was not on any recording because he had never been able to afford a proper recording session, every person in that room was absolutely still, and Sinatra, watching through the curtain gap, felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel in the presence of another performer's work, which was the specific, clean, uncomplicated emotion of witnessing greatness. No ego attached to it, no calculation, just the recognition, pure and unambiguous, that this boy had it, the real thing, the thing that could not be taught or manufactured or assembled from ambition and technical skill, the thing that either existed in a person or did not. And in Marcus Webb it existed in such abundance that it filled a 1,200-seat room and pressed against the walls. When Marcus Webb finished his set and walked off stage into the corridor, slightly dazed in the way that performers are sometimes dazed when a performance has taken everything they had, he found Frank Sinatra standing there, and Frank looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then he said, very simply, "You're going to be fine," not as encouragement and not as prediction, but as statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between talent and the real thing and who has no patience for pretending otherwise. And Marcus Webb looked at him and said, "Thank you for what you did." And Frank said, "I didn't do anything. You just needed a room." And then he handed Marcus the unlit cigarette he had been holding all evening, not as a gesture that meant anything in particular, just as the natural conclusion of a thing he had been turning over in his fingers for 2 hours. And he walked back down the corridor toward the elevator, and the Copa room behind them was still vibrating with applause that hadn't quite finished deciding whether it was applause or something closer to astonishment. And the winter air outside the sands pressed cold against the windows of Las Vegas. And somewhere in the city Gerald Fitch was sitting at a bar, drinking something he hadn't ordered and thinking about renovations he hadn't requested. And in the corridor, Marcus Webb held the cigarette and looked at it for a moment and put it in the pocket of his good wool coat. And 3 nights later, he closed his engagement at the Copa room to a standing ovation that the Sands entertainment director would later describe, in an internal memo that somehow became public decades later, as the most unexpected thing he had witnessed in 20 years of booking acts in that room. And within 4 months, Marcus Webb had a recording contract. And within 18 months, he had a record on the Billboard chart. And he never spoke publicly about what had happened at the Sands in December of 1961, not in interviews, not in his memoir, which he published in 1979 and which said nothing about Frank Sinatra at all, except to thank him in the acknowledgments without explanation, 2 words at the end of a list of names: "Frank, thanks." And people who read the memoir and knew nothing about what had happened in that corridor would skim past it without pausing. And people who did know would stop at those 2 words and feel the weight of everything that was not in them. All the telephone calls and the 40 minutes in an armchair and the unlit cigarette and the 1,200 people learning to be still. All of it compressed into 2 words that said everything precisely because they explained nothing, which was, in its way, the most Sinatra thing imaginable, the power that doesn't announce itself, the hand that moves without being seen moving. The room that gets made because one man decided, quietly and without performance, that it needed to be made.